Well, welcome to our first topic in Roman Catholicism, a topic that is titled Why Bother with Church History? And what we're going to do in this lecture is talk a bit about why history, not just church history, but history in general, is important. And then we're going to talk a bit about early Christian history and the three periods, the three basic periods of Roman Catholic Church history. So let's start with this basic question of why study the past? And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about ancient history, like the history of Greece and Rome, or if you're talking about uh, the history of China or the history of Western civilization. This is just a basic question that historians often ask themselves. Why do we do this? Why do we study the past? And there have been all kinds of answers to this, but typically, the historian has been trained to respond to this answer by saying, ignorance of the past is not bliss. You do not want to be ignorant of the past, even your own past, because the historian would say, if you don't understand the past, if you don't come to grips with it, if you don't accept it, if you don't work through it, you're bound to keep making the same mistakes of the past in the present. And anyone who's lived long enough probably knows that's true in their own history. So ignorance isn't bliss, and not knowing the past is very problematic. And it's really problematic when you're talking about religious history. You're talking about the history of the Roman Catholic Church, because there are a lot of things today going on in the Roman Catholic Church, making headlines in the New York Times or the Boston Globe, that go back far into the history of the Roman Catholic Church. And in some respects, there are things that happened throughout the history of the Catholic Church that it's only been in the last few decades that certain leaders in the Catholic Church have begun to come to grips with what happened in the past, and sometimes even to apologize for mistakes of the past. So whether it's church history, whether it's the history of the United States, we can't move forward in life, even in our own personal histories, without understanding the past and knowing the past. And this is why, if you look at psychoanalysis and Freudian psychoanalysis, this is why they spend so much time wanting you to talk about your past, because there's this fundamental belief in in psychological fields that your past does have some kind of impact on your present. Well, when we look at the past, the mistake we don't want to make as historians, and sometimes this is difficult for some individuals, the mistake we don't want to make is whitewashing the past. We have to tell the truth. Whether it's American history, whether it's British history, whether it's European history, you name it, we have to tell the truth. And this wasn't always the case, especially among church historians. A lot of times you whitewash the past. You just accentuated the positives and said, well, you didn't talk much about the negatives. Or if you did, you said, yeah, that might be true, but what about this? Isn't this more important? To really do church history, given the history of the Catholic Church and how long that history is, we have to accentuate negatives and positives. And we have to be honest about things, especially in Roman Catholicism, because Roman Catholic Church history can get really, really ugly. It doesn't take long before it gets really, really ugly. And we are talking about 2,000 years of history here, from the first century on into the beginning of the 21st century. The church at times has been anti-Semitic. The church at times has done horrible things, as you'll see, like the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition. All of the stuff that we still hear about, the movie Spotlight and the uncovering by a team of investigators at the Boston Globe of all of the cover-ups of the sex scandals and the molestation of children and all that sort of stuff. There is some just ugly stuff in Roman Catholic Church history, and sometimes the most fascinating stuff is the ugly stuff. So that has to be talked about. We can't just throw it out, because again, if we throw it out, ignorance isn't bliss when you're dealing with the past, because it comes back and haunts you in the present. But there's a lot of positives throughout history as well. There's the Oscar Romeros, the Dorothy Days, the Dan and Phil Berrigans, who stood up against oppression and stood on the side of the poor and worked for the poor. So in order to do this correctly, and we're going to do this throughout this course, is we're going to talk about the truth of things. And the truth sometimes can be hellacious, but the truth of what happened in history, we all have to confront. And that's the same when it comes to our own personal individual histories and experiences. We have to be honest about them. We have to confront them. We have to make sense of them. So here are some of the goals for this course. And this goes along in your syllabus with the course outcomes and the learning objectives. First of all, in this course, you're going to learn about the major themes, periods, and movements of the Roman Catholic Church. And there's going to be a lot of information here, and it's going to go quick. But before we go any further with that, let me explain something. Simply knowing Roman Catholic Church history doesn't mean, when you come out of this course, that you know all about Christianity. Even if you were just taking a basic church history course, or if you were taking a History of Western Civ course, there's all these limits that we often don't think about. The history of Roman Catholicism, even the history of the Protestant Church, which we're going to talk about quite a bit in this course because of the interactions between Protestantism and Catholicism in the 16th century, what we're really talking about is Latin Western Christianity. We aren't talking about Greek Orthodoxy, Greek Christianity, or Eastern Christianity. We aren't talking about Coptic Christianity in Egypt. We aren't talking about Syriac-speaking Christianity. We aren't even talking about the eastern branches of Roman Catholicism. Because this field is so big and it covers so much time and so much material, the reality is we're limited in what we can do. We're talking about the kind of Christianity, Latin Christianity, that became the dominant Christianity in the Western world, in Western Europe, and also in the United States, Canada, Mexico, South America. So it's important to keep in mind that even though you're going to learn all of this information, there is a whole other story about other kinds of Christianities going on that you would have to take another course or two to cover all of those. But because we live where we live, and because we are part of Western culture in the Western world, and since you are at a Roman Catholic school, Albertus Magnus College, we are limiting ourselves to Latin Christianity and Latin understandings, Western understandings of Roman Catholic Church history. Some other goals in this course are these. One of the big things that I hope all of you come out of here grasping and understanding about Catholicism is that real Catholicism, not pop Catholicism, social Catholicism that you sometimes see, particularly here in New Haven, is all about faith-seeking understanding. As we go through this course, you're going to meet a lot of important Catholic theologians and Catholic intellectuals who will tell you, please ask questions about God. There is nothing wrong with that. You'll meet some, like Abelard, who will say, doubt is how you get to faith, that faith is a journey, and faith is constantly in pursuit of the truth. In fact, one of the mottos of the Dominican order, the order that's this school, Albertus Magnus, is part of, is the Latin word veritas, which means truth. And so what I want you to get out of this course is one of and I think this is one of the great things about Roman Catholicism, is that Roman Catholicism is faith seeking truth. It's hope seeking truth or understanding. The second thing, and another goal of this course, is that Catholicism is not an either or religion. Unfortunately, some people turn it into an either or faith, but it's actually a both and faith. And yeah, that's a tension, it's a paradox, but this is really important, is a lot of Roman Catholic thinking, especially when it works correctly, isn't I choose A or I choose B, but I choose A and B, and maybe throw in C as well. And this isn't always an easy way for people to think, because we want to say, well, wait a minute, there can only be one right answer. And sometimes Catholicism will say, when it works properly, of no, there isn't one right answer to that question. Or it isn't a matter of the answer being right or wrong. It's a matter of one answer being wise and another answer being unwise. Or maybe there are multiple answers to the same question. Faith and reason are also very important to the Catholic tradition and to Catholic history. Now, sometimes the Catholic Church forgot this, but what this means in modern terms, and this goes all the way back to Thomas Aquinas, whom you will meet in this course, one of the giants of Catholic, in Catholic theology. In fact, Aquinas Hall is named after him. Faith and reason go together in Catholicism. A modern way of thinking about this is religion and science aren't at odds. They both have their functions. They both can work together. And this is part of the both and. They both can help one another better find truth. Now, people like Aquinas understood this. Teilhard de Chardin understood this. The Vatican today understands this. Vatican scientists with the Vatican Planetarium and so on and so forth really understand this. A lot of Christianities in the United States have this sort of antagonistic relationship between faith and science, or faith and reason. But traditionally and throughout its history, Catholicism has not had that. Whether it's science, whether it's philosophy, it's borrowed those things and said, okay, what can this teach us about faith? What else can this show us? Another goal is to learn about the common good, particularly in its social teaching, which we'll talk about towards the end of this course. Catholicism has always said, unlike a lot of Western philosophy and politics, decisions must be made that are best for everyone, the common good. Decisions must be made that include everyone. Now, we live in a world that works on these utilitarian principles in which you make the best decision based on what is best for the greatest number of people. Catholicism rejects that and says the best decision is for the good of all. Not just the majority, but also the minority. And one of the other things we'll talk about towards the end of this course is modern social justice in the Catholic Church, which is unfortunately one of the great, great secrets of the Catholic Church that even many Catholics don't talk about or know about. So these are the basic goals of the course, and along with the course objectives and the learning objectives of these are the kinds of things we're going to talk about and you're going to learn throughout this course. Now, before we go any further, I need to give you a crash course in biblical history, Greco-Roman history, which will then get us to Roman Catholic Church history. So this is going to go by really, really quickly. Your quiz for this week is not based on any of this, but I want to try and give you some sort of chronological framework in which to understand where does Roman Catholicism, where does it really come about? Where does it fit in world history? So when you're talking about Christian history, you obviously have to start with Jewish history. Since Jesus was a Jew, his first followers were all Jewish. You have to go back to the history of Judaism, the history of the Jewish people. And if we do that, here's the basic chronology of Jewish history, and this is sort of a basic chronology of the history that we find in the Old Testament. Around the year 1850 BC, so about close to 2,000 years, give or take 150 or so years before the birth of Jesus, the God of the Jews, whose name is Yahweh, some Christians mistakenly think the personal name of God is Jehovah. That's actually a misreading of the Hebrew. The name of God is actually Yahweh. Speaks to a man in Mesopotamia named Abraham. Abraham is called by God, at a ripe old age actually, to become the father of the Jewish people. He's asked by Yahweh to give up the gods and goddesses of Mesopotamia and to only worship Yahweh. So this covenant is made between the God of Israel and Abraham will become the father of the Israelites, the father of the Jewish people. After Abraham and his descendants, the Jewish people, the ancient Israelites, will end up in Egypt, where they will be enslaved by one of the Egyptian pharaohs, probably Ramesses II. And a man rises up, Moses, who's a great liberator, the years 1250 to 1220 BC. And Moses frees his people, the Israelites, from slavery. And this all occurs in the book of Exodus, the second book of the Old Testament. The Israelite slaves then go through the desert, and they end up wandering around for 40-some years until much later they end up in the Promised Land. And when they get there, they find out that the Promised Land that God had told them, Yahweh tells them to go to, is inhabited by a group of people known as the Canaanites. And after a series of battles with the Canaanites, at least according to the biblical text, a monarchy is established. First with a king called Saul, then a king called David, and then David's son Solomon in the years 1010 to the year 970 BC, builds the first temple to Yahweh in the city of Jerusalem. And things are going well for a while for the Jewish people until they're attacked by all these different empires. The Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire. Finally, in the year 587 BC, the Babylonians march into what we today would call Israel. They destroy the temple that Solomon had erected to Yahweh. They capture many of the Israelites and they take them into exile. They take them east into Babylon, into ancient Mesopotamia, what today is modern-day Iraq. While this history is going on, there is a simultaneous history that starts to take place with the Romans. So what's complex about biblical history, which also leads into church history, is there are a lot of histories you have to know to even get to church history. And again, we're simply scratching the surface here. I mean, these are just key dates that anyone should know who's in college and in university and learning about the Western world. Around the year 753 BC, at least according to the mythology of Rome, Romulus establishes the city of Rome. Rome really begins to get its power. It really begins to take shape between the years 509 and 44 BC. This is when Rome becomes a republic. And for a long time, Rome was a republic. It was not an empire. But all of this ends with that famous story of the assassination of Julius Caesar on the floor of the Roman Senate. The history of Rome would have been very, very different if Julius Caesar had lived. His assassination, and many of the people who participated in this, led to Rome going from being a republic to being an empire. And of course, the assassination of Julius Caesar, made famous by Shakespeare, has that line of "Et tu, Brute?" You too, Brutus, where Caesar, while he's dying, realizes that those closest to him have betrayed him. Well, what happens is Caesar had an adopted son named Octavian. Octavian will fight against the conspirators who conspired against his adopted father, Julius Caesar. In 31 BC, Octavian will begin the Roman Empire, and he will eventually change his name from Octavian to Augustus, and he will become the first emperor of Rome. He will be the emperor of Rome when Jesus is born. The key dates of Christianity are these. In 604 BC, Jesus is born. There's a lot of scholarly debate as to whether it was in the year 6 or whether it was in the year 4. You can read articles that will convince you either way. I do not care which one you think it is. So that's why I simply write 604 BC. Sometime between 6 and 4, Jesus was born. He was not born in the year 0. There is no year 0 in the ancient world. So if historians are off by a couple years here and there when you're talking about events thousands of years ago, it's not that big of a deal. Jesus dies sometime around the year 30. There are scholars who argue it's the year 33. That might be true. It might not be true. I'm not very attached to this date or that date. But basically, Jesus was somewhere in his early to mid-30s when he dies. These are the two big key events in Christianity, because obviously all Christianity is going to go back to Jesus. So 604 BC, Jesus is born. 34, 35, 36 years later, he dies around the year 30. There is an ongoing history from, there's an intertwined history, I should say, that exists with even at the birth of Jesus, the death of Jesus, and the Roman Empire. It's going to go on for centuries. The relationship between the first Christians and the Roman Empire is a very topsy-turvy relationship. We will talk more about this in this course. For a long time, the Roman Empire simply just tolerates Christianity. Sometimes it starts persecuting Christians. Sometimes it officially starts persecuting Christians, especially under the Emperor Diocletian. But 313, 381 are key dates in the history of the relationship between Christianity and the Roman Empire. We will come back and talk about those dates, but these are two dates on which the Roman Empire goes from persecuting Christians, tolerating Christians at times, to actually accepting and favoring Christians and the Christian faith. In fact, it's during this period of time where Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, which seems ironic considering that Rome is involved in the death of Jesus. The crucifixion of Jesus is a Roman form of punishment. In 476 AD, Rome will fall. When Rome falls, what's there to pick up the pieces? the church. This is certainly in this period of time where you really start to get hardcore Roman Catholic Church history. And this is where you really start to see the church gain its power. So, to summarize some of this, keeping in mind that there's the chronology of Jewish history, the chronology of Roman history, there are basically three major epochs or time periods to church history. And these are the three periods we're going to be studying. Now, some people say there's five, some people say there's four. Three to me seems like a good religious number since the Trinity is three. So we're going to use three. The first period of church history is called the early church. And this goes from the death of Jesus in the year 30 to Charlemagne in the year 800. It's a long period of time, but this is a period of change in the church. This is a period in which the church experiences persecution. It's trying to find its identity. It's trying to make its mark in the world. It's also a time when the church wins. It becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire and gains power and prestige. The second period is the medieval church, and this is also a long period of time. It goes from Charlemagne in 800 to the Protestant reformer Martin Luther in the year 1517, when he nails his 95 Theses to a church and says, these are my complaints against Catholicism. And then you have the beginnings of Protestantism. So this second period is a very long period that's going to encompass religious orders like the Franciscans and the Dominicans, talking about St. Dominic and St. Francis, Thomas Aquinas, the rise of universities, medieval Catholicism, all kinds of problems that happen from one pope to the next pope. And it ends really with the coming of the great Protestant reformer, Martin Luther, who wants not to split the church, but to reform it from within. And then inevitably, a number of things happen in which it splits. And suddenly you have Protestantism, different Protestantisms, plural, and then Catholicism. And then you have all kinds of problems back and forth between Catholics and Protestants that are misunderstood by a lot of people even in the modern period. So when we get to the second period, the end of it, and then moving into the third period of church history, we will have to talk a lot about what is the difference between being Catholic and being Protestant. And then the third period goes from the time of the Reformation, 1517, to the modern church. It goes from Martin Luther to a very key thing that happened in the 1960s called Vatican II that radically changed the Roman Catholic Church, on down to Pope Francis and the church in the 21st century. So like I said, we have a lot of ground here to cover. And this is why I'm going to be giving you little mini quizzes instead of having you write essays and having you take long examinations or tests, midterm, final, because it's important for you not so much to get the dates right, to get all the names right, but to understand, oh yeah, the early church, here's some of the key things that happened in this time period, 30 to 800. The medieval church, yeah, here's some of the key things that happened from Charlemagne to Luther. And then again, with our third period, the Reformation, the modern church, here's some key things about Luther, about Protestantism, about Vatican II, and about modern Catholicism. So don't get too hung up on dates and names. Think about the big ideas here. Of course, there are some key names you should know and some key dates that you should know, but think more about the big ideas, the founding ideas, the unique ideas that come about in each one of these periods. That's it for this lecture. In our next lecture, which I will put up in a day or two, we will talk about Jesus and the life of his earliest followers. Obviously, if you're going to talk about Roman Catholicism or Protestantism or any kind of church history, it's best to start with Jesus. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start not with his death, but talk a bit about his life, about what historians have said about the historical Jesus, and a few other things. So, and again, I want to remind you that the quiz for this week, you only have one, is not on this lecture. It is on this lecture, simply sets up the rest of the lectures. It will be on the next lecture on Jesus and his early followers. It will be no more than 10 questions on your quiz, probably just 5, just to ease you into things. And again, you do not have to have all of this work done until Sunday at midnight. I will not start checking to make sure that you have done your assignments and done your work till early Monday morning. If you have any questions about anything we have talked about, obviously email me. If you are in the blended course, I will see you on Thursday.